The Hegemony had always prided itself on being the galaxy's premier collection agency. Not for debts, mind you, though they did excel at extracting those as well, but for acquiring the universe's most fascinating specimens. Their vast empire stretched across 17 star systems, each planet catalogued, categorized, and thoroughly disappointed by the inevitable bureaucratic paperwork that followed conquest. For 3 millennia, they had operated under a simple philosophy: if it thinks, we can think better. If it creates, we can create more efficiently. If it resists, well, resistance was merely a temporary inconvenience solved by the judicious application of superior technology and condescending patience. The discovery of Earth had been, quite frankly, an accident. Navigator Yeftal had been searching for a decent coffee substitute after the crew's latest supply run had yielded nothing but what could only be described as liquid disappointment in ceramic form. Instead, his sensors picked up electromagnetic chatter from a small blue planet, tucked away in an unremarkable spiral arm, the sort of galactic neighborhood where civilizations went to quietly develop without bothering anyone important. The initial scans revealed a species that should have been utterly unremarkable. Humans possessed no natural armor, no telepathic abilities, no capacity for interstellar travel, and most puzzling of all, they had somehow managed to avoid destroying themselves despite possessing both nuclear weapons and social media. By all reasonable hegemony standards, they should have been filing for extinction centuries ago. Yet there was something in their neural patterns that caught the attention of the Hegemony's cognitive research division. These creatures, despite their obvious technological limitations, exhibited brain activity that was chaotic, beautifully, frustratingly chaotic. Where Hegemony minds operated in elegant, predictable patterns refined over millennia of evolution, human thoughts resembled a jazz ensemble having an argument during an earthquake. Evelyn Thorne represented everything the Hegemony found simultaneously fascinating and bewildering about her species. At 34, she had already revolutionized 3 separate fields of neuroscience, developed a new treatment for degenerative brain disease, and somehow found time to maintain a social media presence that alternated between groundbreaking research updates and pictures of her extraordinarily photogenic cat. Her work on consciousness mapping had attracted attention throughout Earth's scientific community, but it had also pinged on Hegemony's senses like a dinner bell in a monastery. Here was a mind that not only understood the intricate dance of neural networks, but could manipulate them with an artistry that bordered on the miraculous. The fact that she accomplished this with technology the Hegemony considered barely above stone tools only made her more intriguing. The infiltration began with what humans quaintly called first contact protocols. The Hegemony's diplomatic corps, a collection of beings whose job it was to make conquest sound like a mutually beneficial cultural exchange, made their grand entrance with all the subtlety of a supernova in a library. They chose Geneva for the announcement, partly for its historical significance and mostly because the city had excellent parking. Ambassador Kexinar, whose species had evolved from something resembling a cross between a jellyfish and a philosophy professor, delivered the news with the kind of manufactured enthusiasm typically reserved for timeshare presentation. Greetings, people of Earth. The translation devices rendered his speech in 17 languages simultaneously. We come in peace, friendship, and with a sincere desire to share the wonders of galactic civilization with your developing species. The subtext, which any species with half a brain could detect, was, "We're here to see what you've got that we might want to take." Dr. Thorne watched the broadcast from her laboratory at the European Neural Research Institute, surrounded by equipment that hummed with the quiet intensity of discovery and progress. Her initial reaction was the same as most of her colleagues: skepticism mixed with the kind of excitement that comes from realizing your field of study had just expanded to include the entire galaxy. The Hegemony's representatives were effusive in their praise of human achievement, particularly in the field of consciousness research. They spoke of collaboration, of sharing knowledge, of advancing both species through mutual cooperation. They assured everyone particularly interested in meeting Earth's most brilliant minds. Dr. Thorne should have been suspicious when the invitation arrived, not because alien contact was inherently untrustworthy, though it was, but because the letter was hand-delivered by a being who looked like a cross between a filing cabinet and a disappointed parent, yet somehow knew exactly where she kept her spare key. The research facility they proposed was magnificent, a floating laboratory positioned at Earth's L4 Lagrange point, equipped with technology that made her current equipment look like a child's toy. The opportunity to study consciousness with tools that could map individual neural pathways in real time was too tempting to refuse. The trap, when it finally sprung, was almost elegant in its simplicity. One moment she was calibrating a neural interface that promised to revolutionize her understanding of human consciousness, and the next she was experiencing that consciousness being very efficiently catalogued by minds that considered her little more than an interesting puzzle to be solved. Consciousness returned like a bad hangover, coupled with the distinct impression that someone had been rearranging the furniture in her skull while she slept. Thorne found herself in what could only be described as the galaxy's most sterile waiting room, if waiting rooms were designed by beings who had heard about comfort secondhand and decided it was probably overrated. The walls were a shade of beige that managed to be simultaneously soothing and deeply unsettling, as if the color itself had been focus grouped by a committee of anxious accountants. The lighting emanated from no visible source, casting the kind of even illumination that suggested the room had been designed by creatures who had never experienced a sunset and were quite proud of this fact. Her restraints were, she had to admit, impressively sophisticated. Rather than crude metal shackles, she found herself held by what appeared to be solidified light energy fields that adapted to her movements with the kind of responsive precision that spoke of technology so advanced it had probably become bored with its own capability. The door, when it finally materialized from what had previously been a seamless wall, revealed her captors in all their bureaucratic glory. The lead investigator was a being whose species had apparently evolved from something that had taken the concept of professional detachment and made it their entire personality. They moved with the kind of methodical precision that suggested they had never encountered a problem that couldn't be solved through the proper application of forms filed in triplicate. "Welcome to Research Station Omega 7. The creature announced, its voice carrying the emotional warmth of a tax audit. "I am Principal Investigator Herndal of the Hegemony Cognitive Analysis Division. You may address me as Principal Investigator." The translator rendered this in perfect English, though it somehow managed to make even simple words sound like they were being filtered through several layers of institutional bureaucracy. Thorne tested her restraints experimentally, noting the way the energy fields tightened in response to her movements without actually causing pain. It was the kind of thoughtful engineering that suggested her captors were either remarkably humane, or had simply calculated that damaged specimens provided less reliable data. "I suppose asking for a lawyer would be pointless," she said, more to gauge their reaction than out of any real hope of legal representation, "or at least a really good cup of coffee." Principal Investigator Herndal tilted what might have been its head in a gesture that probably indicated confusion in whatever cultural context had produced it. "Your primitive legal systems have no jurisdiction here. As for the beverage you mentioned, our nutritional protocols will provide all necessary sustenance for the duration of your processing." Processing. The word hung in the air like a bureaucratic threat wrapped in clinical terminology. The questioning began with what the Hegemony undoubtedly considered sophisticated psychological techniques. They had, it seemed, studied human interrogation methods with the kind of academic thoroughness that completely missed the point. Their approach combined the worst aspects of a job interview, a doctoral defense, and a visit to the Department of Motor Vehicles. They wanted to understand her work on consciousness mapping, but their questions revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of how human creativity actually functions. Where they expected linear thought processes and logical progressions, they encountered the magnificent chaos of a mind that had learned to leap between concepts like a caffeinated grasshopper. "Explain your methodology for neural pathway analysis," Herndal demanded, its appendages manipulating a device that recorded her responses in 17 different spectrums. "Well, first I usually have a really good cup of coffee," Thorne replied, watching with interest as the creature's recording equipment registered what appeared to be confusion. "Then I stare at the data until my eyes hurt, have a moment of existential crisis about the nature of consciousness itself, eat entirely too much chocolate, and then suddenly realize that the answer was probably hiding in the one piece of data I'd been deliberately ignoring." The alien's equipment buzzed with what sounded like mechanical frustration. Clearly this was not the systematic methodology they had expected. Hours passed, or what felt like hours. The chamber's timeless lighting made it impossible to track the passage of time with any accuracy. The Hegemony's investigators rotated through in shifts, each bringing their own particular brand of clinical detachment to the proceedings. They tried chemical enhancement, introducing compounds designed to lower mental barriers and encourage cooperation. Thorne found herself experiencing a mild euphoria that made everything seem slightly more amusing than it should have been, including her captors' growing frustration with her response. They attempted technological intervention devices that could supposedly map her neural activity in real time and predict her responses. These produced elaborate displays of brain activity that the aliens studied with the intensity of accountants examining a particularly suspicious expense report. They even tried what appeared to be some form of hypnosis, projecting patterns of light and sound designed to induce a cooperative trance state. Thorne found the display rather pretty and spent most of the session composing mental grocery lists and wondering whether her cat was getting adequate attention from her neighbor. What frustrated the Hegemony most was not her resistance. They had protocols for handling uncooperative subjects, but the sheer unpredictability of her responses. Human consciousness, they were learning, did not operate according to the elegant mathematical principles that governed their own mental processes. Where they expected fear, they found curiosity. Where they anticipated despair, they encountered a morbid fascination with the interrogation process itself. Most bewildering of all, their subject seemed to be taking notes, mental notes, since she lacked writing materials, treating the entire experience as an unprecedented opportunity to study alien psychology from the inside. Your responses are inconsistent with our models, Herndal finally admitted, after yet another session had failed to produce the anticipated breakdown. Our analysis suggests you should be experiencing significant psychological distress. Thorne considered this observation with the kind of academic interest usually reserved for particularly intriguing research data. "Oh, I am," she assured her captor. "But I'm also thinking about how fascinating this whole process is, from a xenopsychological perspective. Do you realize you're giving me data about alien cognitive processes that would revolutionize our understanding of consciousness? I should probably thank you." The silence that followed this statement was so profound that even the environmental systems seemed to pause in confusion. The Hegemony's response to their subjects' unexpected gratitude was precisely what one might expect from a civilization that had spent 3 millennia perfecting the art of bureaucratic overthinking. They called a committee meeting. Thorne, still secured in her energy restraints, found herself temporarily alone while her captors retreated to what she could only assume was a conference room filled with the kind of beings who considered thinking outside the box to be a dangerous revolutionary concept. The opportunity for solitude was, she realized, exactly what she needed to begin her counter-offensive, because that's what this was, she had concluded during the most recent interrogation session. Not a capture, not an imprisonment, but the opening moves of a psychological chess game, where her opponents had the distinct disadvantage of having never encountered a species that considered insanity a competitive sport. The chamber's surveillance systems were undoubtedly sophisticated, but they were designed to monitor a subject's attempts to escape, not to analyze the subtle ways a human mind could begin reshaping its environment through nothing more than persistent strategic weirdness. She began with something simple, humming. Not random humming, mind you, but a carefully selected piece, Mozart's Requiem, rendered in a deliberately off-key manner that suggested either complete tone deafness or a profound disregard for musical convention. The surveillance equipment dutifully recorded every note, filing it away in databases that were undoubtedly trying to determine whether this was some form of coded communication or primitive stress response. When Principal Investigator Herndal returned, flanked by what appeared to be the Hegemony equivalent of middle management, Dr. Thorne greeted them with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for unexpected dinner guests. "Oh good, she announced, as if the aliens had been away on vacation rather than consulting about her psychological processing. "I've been thinking about your methodology, and I have some suggestions." The delegation exchanged glances, or what passed for glances among beings whose visual organs operated on principles that would have given human optometrists existential crises. "Subjects do not make suggestions," Herndal stated with the kind of flat certainty that suggested this was probably written somewhere in the Hegemony Manual of Proper Interrogation Procedures. "Well, that's your first mistake," Dr. Thorne replied cheerfully. "You're treating this like a standard extraction operation, but you're dealing with a human consciousness. We're not designed to be logical, we're designed to be magnificently creatively unreasonable." She paused, noting the way the aliens' recording equipment was working overtime to process this information. "For instance," she continued,
Your chemical enhancement protocols are based on the assumption that lowering mental barriers will make me more cooperative. But human creativity actually increases when we're slightly chemically altered. You're not making me compliant. You're making me more inventive. This observation was met with the kind of silence typically reserved for profound revelations or catastrophic system failure. The truth was more complex than her simplified explanation suggested. Dr. Thorne had spent years studying consciousness, and she understood better than most how the human brain responded to stress, chemicals, and psychological pressure. More importantly, she understood how alien minds might process that information. The hegemony operated on principles of logical efficiency. They expected cause and effect to follow predictable patterns. They assumed that sufficient pressure, properly applied, would eventually break any resistance. What they hadn't counted on was encountering a species that had evolved, not just to survive pressure, but to transform it into something entirely unexpected. Over the following sessions, Dr. Thorne began implementing what she privately called Operation Cognitive Chaos. It was a strategy that relied on the fundamental incompatibility between human unpredictability and alien need for systematic understanding. She began telling her interrogators stories, not dramatic tales of resistance or defiance, but meandering human anecdotes that seemed to have no point whatsoever. She told them about her cat's peculiar habit of knocking houseplants off windowsills. She described in excruciating detail the plot of every romantic comedy she'd ever seen. She provided lengthy explanations of human holidays, with particular emphasis on the inexplicable traditions surrounding something called Black Friday shopping. The aliens listened with the kind of desperate attention usually reserved for critical technical manuals, trying to decode hidden meanings in descriptions of office birthday parties and traffic jams. The significance of the cake ritual remains unclear. She overheard one investigator reporting to another during a shift change. The subject becomes emotionally activated when discussing optimal frosting distribution methods. But the real psychological warfare began when Dr. Thorne started asking questions of her own. "I'm curious about your species' approach to creativity," she mentioned during one session, as if making casual conversation rather than being interrogated by beings who considered her a research specimen. The question seemed to cause some kind of processing error in Herndal's translation system. "Dreams are inefficient neural maintenance protocols," the alien finally responded. "They serve no productive function." "Oh, that's fascinating," Dr. Thorne replied with genuine interest. "So you've never experienced the kind of problem solving that happens when your conscious mind stops trying to control the process. You've never had those moments when the answer to something appears fully formed after you stop thinking about it." She could practically hear the gears turning in the aliens' collective consciousness as they tried to categorize this information. "We solve problems through systematic analysis and logical progression," Herndal stated, though there was something in its tone that suggested uncertainty. "That must be exhausting," Dr. Thorne observed sympathetically. "Always having to think your way through everything step by step, never getting to experience that moment when your brain makes connections you didn't expect." The interrogation sessions began taking on an increasingly surreal quality, where once the aliens had been asking questions, they now found themselves answering them. Dr. Thorne's innocent curiosity about their mental processes had somehow transformed the dynamic from interrogation to interview. She learned that the hegemony had conquered 17 star systems through the application of overwhelming technological superiority, combined with psychological pressure, designed to break the will of resistance movements. It was a strategy that had worked perfectly for 3 millennia. It was also a strategy that had never encountered a species that considered psychological pressure to be intellectually stimulating. "You know what's really interesting?" Dr. Thorne mentioned during what had originally been scheduled as an intensive compliance session. "The way you're approaching this suggests your species has never had to deal with genuine uncertainty. Everything in your experience follows predictable patterns." She paused, noting the way her captor's attention had focused on her words with the intensity of beings who had just realized they might be missing something important. "That must make existence feel very safe," she continued thoughtfully, "but also kind of limited, don't you think? Never being surprised by your own thoughts, never having to wonder what you might discover if you stopped trying to control the outcome." The silence that followed was different from the bureaucratic confusion she'd encountered before. This silence had weight to it, the kind of pregnant pause that suggested minds encountering concepts they had no framework for processing. Dr. Thorne smiled, recognizing the sound of certainty beginning to crack. The first sign that something fundamental had shifted came when Principal Investigator Herndal arrived for their next session, carrying what could only be described as the alien equivalent of stress medication. The creature's usual bureaucratic composure had developed subtle cracks, like a professional facade that had been forced to process one too many insurance claims written in interpretive dance. "Today we will focus on extracting practical applications from your research," Herndal announced, though its voice carried the kind of forced confidence typically associated with middle management, trying to explain why the quarterly reports were 3 weeks late. Thorne had been expecting this. The Hegemony's patience with her philosophical discussions had clearly reached its bureaucratic limit. They wanted concrete results, neural mapping techniques they could replicate, consciousness manipulation protocols they could standardize, anything that could justify the considerable resources they'd invested in her acquisition. What they got instead was a masterclass in the weaponization of human cognitive flexibility. "Oh, absolutely," she replied with the enthusiasm of someone who had just been asked to explain their favorite hobby. "But first I need to understand how you process recursive self-analysis. Do you ever think about thinking about thinking?" The question hit the alien research team like a philosophical virus. Within minutes their recording equipment was generating error logs as their subjects attempted to monitor their own monitoring processes, while simultaneously analyzing their analysis of the analysis. It was, Thorne reflected, rather like watching a computer try to calculate the last digit of pi while simultaneously running a virus scan on its own processor. The beauty of the recursive consciousness trap was its elegant simplicity. Human minds had evolved to handle self-referential loops. They were in fact one of the fundamental features of human consciousness. But the Hegemony's systematically logical approach to mental processes meant that attempting to analyze self-analysis created exactly the kind of infinite regression that their orderly minds couldn't simply dismiss as one of those weird brain things. "The subject appears to be inducing cognitive paradoxes in our research personnel," she overheard one technician reporting to what sounded like increasingly frantic supervisors. The facility's attempts to contain the spreading cognitive chaos only made things worse. They brought in specialists, beings whose entire careers had been devoted to the systematic breakdown of resistant minds. These experts arrived with advanced equipment, refined techniques, and the kind of professional confidence that comes from centuries of successful psychological manipulation. Dr. Thorne greeted each new team with the same cheerful curiosity she'd shown their predecessors, and then proceeded to introduce them to concepts their training had never prepared them for. She explained to a team of emotion analysis specialists how human creativity often emerged from the intersection of joy and melancholy, causing their equipment to register readings they'd never encountered. She described to logic pattern experts how human problem-solving frequently involved deliberately ignoring logical solutions in favor of intuitive leaps that somehow produced better results. Most devastatingly, she introduced the facility's psychological pressure specialists to the concept of productive failure, the human tendency to learn more from mistakes than from successes. "Your methodology assumes that pressure creates compliance," she explained to a room full of beings whose entire professional identity was built on that assumption. "But humans often respond to pressure by becoming more creative, more resourceful, more willing to try approaches that logic says shouldn't work." The silence that followed wasn't confusion, it was the sound of an entire philosophical framework beginning to collapse. The cascade failure, when it finally came, was breathtaking in its scope. The facility's personnel began questioning not just their approach to human psychology, but their understanding of consciousness itself. Research teams found themselves paralyzed by sudden awareness of the limitations of their own logical processes. Equipment designed to measure and manipulate mental states began producing data that contradicted fundamental hegemony assumptions about the nature of intelligent thought. Dr. Thorne watched it unfold with the fascination of a scientist observing a particularly elegant experiment in real time. She had not, she realized, broken her captors through resistance or defiance. Instead, she had introduced them to the magnificent chaos of human consciousness, and watched as their rigid mental frameworks shattered under the weight of genuine uncertainty. The evacuation order came during what would have been her 14th day in captivity, though the facility's temporal systems had become unreliable as their operators struggled with newfound awareness of subjective time perception. "The specimen will be returned to its point of origin," Herndl announced, though the alien's former authoritative tone had been replaced by something approaching philosophical bewilderment. Our research protocols have proven inadequate for this species. Thorne found herself back on Earth with no clear memory of the transition, deposited in her laboratory, as if the entire experience had been nothing more than an elaborate fever dream. The only evidence of her absence was a small device left on her desk. Hegemony technology that appeared to be some kind of consciousness monitoring equipment. It took her 3 days to realize the device wasn't monitoring her consciousness, it was trying to replicate it. The final irony revealed itself when she managed to access the device's memory banks. The Hegemony hadn't just failed to break her spirit, they had become obsessed with understanding how human consciousness worked. Their entire research division had apparently been restructured around the study of productive cognitive chaos and adaptive uncertainty protocols. According to the device's records, first contact with humanity had been indefinitely postponed pending further research into psychological compatibility matrix. The galaxy's most efficient conquest machine had been brought to a complete standstill by the discovery that some species might be too chaotically creative to conquer safely. Dr. Thorne leaned back in her chair, contemplating the delicious absurdity of it all. The Hegemony had sought to acquire her knowledge, to break her will to reduce human consciousness to something they could catalog and control. Instead, they had encountered a mind that thrived on uncertainty, grew stronger under pressure, and found creative solutions by deliberately ignoring logical limitation. They had tried to break her spirit and discovered that human spirits, properly understood, weren't designed to break. They were designed to transform whatever tried to break them into something entirely unexpected. She picked up the alien device, turning it over in her hands as her cat jumped onto the desk with the kind of perfect timing that suggested feline consciousness might be even more mysterious than anyone had previously suspected. "Well," she said to the device, knowing that somewhere in the galaxy, confused alien researchers were probably still trying to decode the philosophical implications of human-pet relationships. "I suppose I should thank you for the data." The device hummed softly, its alien processors undoubtedly struggling to categorize the emotional resonance of gratitude mixed with amusement, mixed with the kind of creative satisfaction that comes from turning a kidnapping into an impromptu psychology experiment. 3 galaxies away, the Hegemony continued their urgent research into the terrifying possibility that the universe might be far more wonderfully chaotic than they had ever imagined. And Thorne, sipping a truly excellent cup of coffee, began planning her next research paper, Consciousness as Cosmic Comedy, What Alien Psychology Reveals About the Art of Creative Resistance. Some spirits, it turned out, were simply too magnificent to break.